Hello there, welcome to Listen Change Reviews, and this is my video for my personal 10 worst Star Trek time travel episodes. This is a part of a monthly series of videos in which I will pick a different category each month and do 2 separate videos in that category, one for the top 10 worst and another for the 10 best. The 10 best time travel episodes will be out in a couple weeks after this one posts. So when I say time travel, of course, I'm also including time anomalies such as fractured time, time loops, etc., etc. I will be excluding certain alternate timeline episodes because I want to save them for next month's category, which is going to be parallel universes and alternate timelines. But I will get into more explanation of what that looks like in the next video, the top 10 best time travel episodes, because the alternate timeline episodes more apply to that list because there are some alternate timeline episodes that would otherwise have made the best list that I'm going to hold off until next month, and I will explain that in that video. For this video, what I'd like to talk about before I jump into the top 10 is that you may see some episodes on here that you like. So just remember that this is my personal opinion. And I think that the reason why there are episodes on here that are pretty popular, that you yourself may also enjoy, and that I do not like, is because I feel that I generally am more nitpicky about time travel logic than most of the Star Trek fandom. I was raised on time travel. I read The Time Machine by H.G. Wells when I was very, very young. It's been one of my favorite topics to read or watch about since I was very young, and I need my time travel logic to make sense. I need to see evidence that the writers planned it out, that they connected A to B to C to D, have all the dots connected, even if connecting those dots looks like an intricate spider web and it's really complicated and makes your head hurt to put it all together, such as the Netflix show Dark. As long as you can put it together and it does make sense and it was very clearly planned out, then I love it. And if it's more complicated but still makes sense, then I absolutely love it. That's why Dark is one of my favorite shows of all time. But some of the Star Trek episodes in this video just throw in all these different aspects of time travel and just throw it all together, and it doesn't make any sense. And while a lot of other people don't care about that, they just overlook that because there may be good character interactions, there might be a good character story involved, so they tend to be drawn to those episodes and they can overlook the atrocious time travel logic. Well, I can't. So that's why I may have some episodes on this list that other people do enjoy. So just be prepared for that. All right, without any further preamble, let's go ahead and jump into it. My personal top 10 worst time travel, time anomaly episodes in Star Trek. Number 10. At number 10 on my list, getting us started, is All Our Yesterdays from Star Trek, the original series. Now, I like what they were trying to do here. I like the concept, but it is a concept that would have been better left for a film or show outside of the Star Trek universe. A film or show that takes place in the distant future of Earth, where Earth has an apocalypse and people of Earth have to travel back in time in order to survive. That would be interesting. But what they do in this episode is to have Kirk and crew once again travel all across the galaxy just to visit a planet that is exactly like Earth. To me, this is the same crap as the Chicago Gangster episode and the Roman Empire episode and the Nazi episode, all that crap from season 2 that I hate. In this episode, Kirk goes back in time to the Salem witch trials, which is bullshit. There is not a planet on the other side of the galaxy that also had Salem witch trials. This kind of thing drives me crazy. Now, the other storyline is Spock and McCoy going back to an ice age. Sure, other planets can have ice ages too. Sure, whatever. But they try to force end this plot convenient thing where people become dumber when they go back in time. I think that was just there to add tension, and it really does not work for me. So, nice effort, but it fails just like most episodes in the 3rd season of the original series. Number 9. At number 9, Time's Arrow Parts 1 and 2 from Star Trek The Next Generation. So this also is a nice effort. It has some fun scenes with Samuel Clemens in it. Data has some funny scenes. There's some good character story beats between Picard and Guinan, etc., etc. But this episode fails on several fronts. First, the time travel logic. Now, I talked at the top of this video about how I need time travel logic to make sense. Here, it's not that it doesn't make sense, it's that it is not consistent with the rest of the Star Trek universe, which is also a big one for me. When you're going to create a cinematic universe or a television universe, then the time travel logic has to be the same across that entire universe. In 95% of Star Trek episodes, Star Trek uses what my brother and I would call the Type 2 time travel logic, which is the Back to the Future time travel logic. If you go back into the past, you change it. This inexplicably uses Type 1 time travel logic, where if you go back in time, whatever you do there has always happened. I call it the whatever happened time travel rule. But it's not consistent with the rest of the Star Trek universe, and that really bugs me, but that is far from the only reason why this makes this list. Also, this episode really doesn't have much of a plot. It was just kind of an excuse to have Samuel Clemens in there and have a little time travel episode. I can never even remember what it is about. It's some aliens trying to suck the energy out of something. It's just so uninteresting, and keep that in mind because that's going to apply to the next episode as well. And there's really no plot. It just kind of meanders around. And in part 2, the entire rest of the crew, besides Picard and Data, who are already back in time, travel back in time to join them for really no reason. There's no purpose for them being there. They don't really do anything. They're just there because, you can't have an episode without them in it. You can't have an episode with just Picard and Data and Guinan in it. But it just wasn't really well thought out. It's not a really well written episode. And unfortunately, as good of an effort as it is, it does make number 9 on my worst list.
Number 8 is great! Yay!
At number 8, A Matter of Time from Star Trek The Next Generation. So this is another one that had an interesting concept that was not applied well. So this episode features a so-called time traveler from, I believe, the 26th century is where he claims to be from, but it turns out he's actually a con man from the 22nd century who stole the time machine from a traveler from the 26th century in order to go into Picard's time and con them into getting all of their technology. And all throughout the episode, he is behaving as if the event that they are experiencing in this episode is ultra important and he knows how it's going to turn out. Well, I knew that this was a con man, or at least a liar, from the beginning of the episode, and the reason why I knew this is because he was trying to pretend that this event that was happening was really important, and it was so obvious that this event was so uninteresting. It is so not important. There is no possible way for that event to turn out to be anything important. And I can't even remember what the event is. That's how uninteresting and forgettable it is. Now, can you imagine if instead they had a plot where Picard and crew had an encounter with the Romulans, and say there was a lot of tension between them and the Romulans, and this phony time traveler comes in and is like, oh yes, this was a really big event. And then you can do a misdirect and say, oh, actually this wasn't a big deal after all. But at least we would believe that it is a big deal, because an encounter with the Romulans might actually be something that's really important. But whatever the hell this thing was that I don't even remember anymore was so obviously not important. So this episode just ends up being incredibly uninteresting and incredibly boring. Number 7. At number 7, Relativity from Star Trek Voyager. Now this is one of the episodes I was thinking of at the top of this video when I said there will be some episodes on here that you may love, because this is a pretty popular episode. And there are reasons to love it. There's great character interactions between 7 of 9 and the first season version of Janeway. It's really interesting to see those two characters come together and how Janeway learns to trust 7 to 9. However, I would actually say that they applied this same concept in a much better episode with Janeway and Chakotay a couple of seasons later, in an episode that you may or may not see on my top 10 best time travel list, but this one makes the worst list. My biggest beef with this episode is that it is not consistent with continuity, and I am not a canon hawk, but you need to at least adhere to the canon of your own goddamn show. So this episode brings us back Captain Braxton, who last appeared in the episode Future's End. Now, they recast him. That's fine. That's not my problem. I don't care about the recast. But at the end of the Future's End episodes, Captain Braxton does not remember ever having encountered Voyager. He says, oh, no, the timeline has changed. You're talking about a different timeline. But here, all of a sudden, he does remember all of the events from Future's End, inexplicably so. But the explanation, actually, it's not inexplicably, because the explanation is they wanted to have this cheesy plot where Captain Braxton was just stewing over Voyager. I'm gonna get you, Voyager. So he gets to the point where he goes crazy and tries to destroy Voyager. So they needed to not be continuous with the previous episodes in order to force feed in this cheesy ass plot. Is one of the worst motivations for a villain I've ever seen in Star Trek. It's just downright dumb. So that is why Relativity, despite being a somewhat popular episode, is number 7 on my list of worst time travel episodes. Number 6. At number 6, Captain's Holiday from Star Trek The Next Generation. And if you're thinking to yourself, what are you talking about, Alyssa? You mean that crappy Romancing the Stone ripoff that you talked about in your top 10 worst romance episode list? That one? Yes, that one. It is also a time travel episode, lest you forget, because it does prominently feature 2 time travelers from, I think, the 27th century, something like that. And it's kind of one of the dumbest reasons for time travel I've ever seen. They go back in time to find this UTEP or something like that. It's never really explained why this is so important, because the episode really focuses more on the crappy romance that I talked about last month with Bosch and Picard. And in the end, this also, like Time Zero, ends up with type 1 time travel logic, because they're like, oh yeah, when Picard, when he destroys the UTEP or whatever that thing is called, they're like, oh yeah, that always happened, so that's fine, we'll just go now. It's dumb. So this is a waste of time travel. If they want to do a crappy romance episode, go all in on that. You don't need to throw time travel into it. Number 5. At number 5, Time's Orphan from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. this is another episode that had a good idea. It's just unable to execute. So this is the episode where Miles and Keiko O'Brien lose their daughter Molly into this weird time anomaly whole thing where she ends up on another planet all by herself and then comes back a couple hours later, and since time moves at a different rate on that planet that she was on, she is older now, and she has just been raised completely by herself with no other human beings at all. It's a very interesting look into what might happen if a person was raised without anyone to help them develop a language, without anyone to help them socialize, and that's what happens. And she ends up having a really hard time integrating into Miles and Keiko's world, so they make the really hard decision to let her go and let her return to the planet that she grew up on, because that's what she really, really wants to do. So how heartfelt and powerful would that have been if they do just let her go, and then we move forward from there with Miles and Keiko having lost their daughter because they made a really hard decision. Instead, that whole thing just gets completely undone because inexplicably young Molly comes back, and it is as if that whole episode never happened, and I wonder why I just wasted an hour of my life watching this episode that turns out to be kind of pointless. Number 4. At number 4, staying with Deep Space Nine, Little Green Men. And this is one of the episodes I was referring to that is kind of popular. I know a lot of people enjoy this episode. And my disenjoyment of this episode actually doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the time travel logic, although the time travel logic is not my favorite, as once again, this is an episode that is using that type 1 whatever happened time travel logic, which is not consistent with the 95% of the Star Trek episodes, and they're doing it just so they can have this cutesy pootsy silly plot where Quark and the Ferengi were the aliens at Roslin all along, which is just dumb, but that is why they had to use the different time travel logic. But that's not really the primary reason that this is so high on my list. Really, I just don't like comedies in Star Trek, generally speaking, especially when they are Ferengi-centric comedies from Deep Space Nine. I think the vast majority of them are garbage. And the reason is, for me, that these Ferengi episodes are basically just reiterating the same joke in different ways over and over and over and over and over and over. And that joke is, oh, look at how greedy the Ferengi are. Look at these funny, silly things that they do to show how greedy they are. And to have Quark doing that, oh, look at how greedy he is, back in the 1940s on Earth is just absolutely silly. It's kind of hard to sit through, and it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Again, the only reason they do it is just so they can have this cutesy little plot where it turns out the Ferengi were the Roswell aliens this whole time. And we all know that's not true. We know it's the Greys, right? You know, it's those aliens with the big eyes. That's what was in Roswell. It wasn't the Ferengi. I'm kidding. But anyways, this episode is just as dumb as all of the other stupid Ferengi episodes in Deep Space Nine, and that is why I don't really like this as much as a lot of people do, and it comes in at number 4 on my worst time travel episode list.
Number 3.
At number 3, Yesteryear from the animated series. This is one that I know a lot of people will disagree with me on, because this is generally considered the best or one of the best episodes of the animated series. And I'm sure it's because people are really into the Spock backstory and think it's a good Spock character story. But I can't even begin to look at the Spock story here because I am just way too distracted by the atrocious time travel logic in this episode. But before I even get into that, I have to talk about how the premise of this episode also makes no sense. because Kirk and the crew were just hanging out by the Guardian of Forever with some scientists and just casually studying history through the Guardian of Forever. That is so dangerous. You can so easily change the timeline, and that is in fact what happens here. There's no way that they would actually do that. It was just the animated series' cheap way of having a sequel of an original series episode, which is what they do quite a bit in the animated series. Now, let's talk through this time travel logic. So not only does this use that type 1, whatever happened time travel logic, but it mixes it together with the type 2 time travel logic in which time can be changed. And this is very nonsensical, and it really makes my head hurt to even try to sort through it. But I'm going to try anyway. So, it always happened that Spock was saved as a young boy by his older self. So apparently the original series version that we see only exists because at some point in the future, Spock is going to go back and save his young self. Follow me so far? This always happened. But here, Spock doesn't go back to save his younger self. Instead, he goes off on an entirely different mission, and when he returns, he no longer exists because he didn't go back and save himself. So now he does have to go back and save himself so he can restore the timeline, and he's back to First Officer, and the Andorian First Officer can go away. So it appears to me that what always happened is that Spock changed the timeline so that he doesn't exist, and then was forced to go back and save himself. So apparently this always happened. What you just heard is the sound of my brain exploding, because that makes no sense. I can't even put this all together. It is the most atrocious time travel logic ever used, except for the time travel logic that I'm about to talk about in number 2. So let's go ahead and move on to that.
Number 2.
At number 2, Farewell, the Season 2 finale of Star Trek Picard. Now, I chose this episode to represent the entirety of Season 2 of Star Trek Picard because that was the only fair way to do it. If I were to pick out every episode in Star Trek Picard Season 2 that was a terrible time travel episode, then it would take up more than half of my top 10, and I wanted to give other episodes a chance as well. So this one also mixes type 1 and type 2 time travel logic in a way that makes even less sense than it does in Yesteryear. So let's try to talk through this. So the type 1 time travel logic comes in here because apparently Rios always was meant to stay in the past and live out his life in the 21st century, and Guinan has always had this picture of him that Picard somehow never noticed. And yet, the timeline had been changed earlier in the season, and in fact that was what the entire season was about, was them trying to restore the timeline. So you can't have it, so the timeline has always been changed. That's the same thing that Yesteryear did. You can't do that. That makes no sense. And they do it a couple of times because we are also led to believe that the Jurati Borg Queen, the Borgani, has always existed as well, because the Borgani Queen exists in episode 1 before anyone goes to change the timeline. Never mind the fact that how Q changes the timeline is a complete mystery to me, because it seems like he snaps his fingers in episode 2 to change the timeline, and yet he goes through a lot of trouble to try to change the timeline. Even gets a job at NASA somehow. I don't know who checked his references for that. Anyways, so apparently the Jurati Gerani Borg Queen thing has existed always for these 400 years, alongside the Borg that we know as well. So both Borgs would exist. Did these two Borgs ever interact? Why is it that nobody has ever seen this Gerani Borg Queen before? Why does she just suddenly appear now if she always existed? This makes my head hurt. I better stop now or my head will explode again. This is the most atrocious time travel logic in Star Trek, and it is a disastrous finale to a disastrous season of television. Number one! At number one, the worst time travel episode in all of Star Trek, Assignment Earth from the original series. By my estimation, this is easily the worst time travel episode in Star Trek, even taking into account the atrocious time travel logic from my number 2 and my number 3. So this one, similarly to Yesteryear, Kirk and his crew are just studying history, and they go back in time for really no reason whatsoever. And it is extremely dangerous, again, for them to do such a thing because they could so easily mess things up, and there's no way that they would actually do this. But in this episode, why do they do this? Why do they go back to the 1960s? Well, the answer is simple. So that Gene Roddenberry can have a cheap backdoor pilot for his crappy-ass TV show that he is trying to get on the air called Assignment Earth. I've actually heard people say, oh, well, that sounded like a very interesting show. Well, sure, if you aren't familiar with all the other shows from the 1960s that had this same basic premise, there were different variations of it, but there's always a person who is out of place with the rest of humanity because they have some sort of powers or abilities. Either they're an alien, or they're coming from another planet, or perhaps they are a witch or a genie. You get what I'm saying here? Etc., etc. And there's always at least one person on the show who's trying to keep their secret, and there's all kinds of hijinks as they try to hide who they really are. And we have seen this done again and again in the 1960s, so this is not an original premise. It is, in fact, a crappy show that did not deserve to get on the air, and I am still furious that Gene Roddenberry co-opted Star Trek in order to try to get this crappy show on the air. He completely takes Kirk and Spock mostly out of it, and when they are in the episode, they're actively trying to change the timeline. Gary 7 keeps telling them, hey, you know, I'm from this time. You guys aren't. You just got to leave me alone because things need to happen as the way they're going to happen. You're not supposed to mess with the timeline. And Kirk and Spock are basically like, timeline, shmine line. We're going to try to change it because they need something to do in this episode, because this is not actually a Star Trek episode. It's a crappy backdoor pilot, and it is so heavy-handed. It is so obvious about it. It gets to the point where at the end of the episode, where Kirk and Spock are laughing with each other, oh, well, our ship's computers tell us that these two are going to have all kinds of wacky adventures together. And at that point, I really expected Spock to turn to the screen, break the fourth wall, and say, this fall on NBC, Assignment Earth. And it really would have fit seamlessly into this episode. I wouldn't have batted an eye, because that's how heavy-handed this crappy backdoor pilot was. And that is why this is easily, by far, the worst time travel episode in Star Trek history. Thank you so much for joining me for my 10 worst time travel episodes. Please join me in a couple of weeks as I release my top 10 best Star Trek time travel episodes. Please subscribe, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.